I spent a lot of time then looking at what happens when you have Buddhism, which in certain degree, it makes no sense for the Chinese to have adopted Buddhism, because certain sorts of the worldviews and the philosophical underpinnings of mainstream Buddhism in India just makes no sense in the Chinese context. In other words, Buddhism in India was asking questions that people in China never even thought about asking, right? Partly because Buddhism is responding then to the religious and philosophical developments of India in the 5th century BCE, and China never had to deal with those questions, right? China never had to deal with the developments of Atman theory and Brahman theory in Hinduism, and so they never even asked those questions. So Buddhism is asking those questions, it develops this whole system, and then it comes to China, and to a certain degree, there's so much that Buddhism has to offer that China's like, we don't even know what to do with this. That makes no sense to them. And you actually see this in early Buddhism in China, this huge misunderstanding by a lot of Chinese about what Buddhism's even talking about, right? And that works itself out, and that forces Buddhism then to have to develop and change within the Chinese context to answer the questions that the Chinese people are offering, while still maintaining some sort of continuity with some of their core issues and doctrines and teachings that they deal with, right? So it leads to a wide variety of developments and changes and differences.
So in China, the Buddhism that rose up, there's a side group that came off, kind of an academic scholastic Buddhism, but during the first Great Purges, they kind of wiped out, they chopped the head off of all the intellectuals. The Buddhism that survived in China was the peasants, because they were way out in the field, and it was primarily meditation, because meditation is a tool, but it was Chan is the tradition we're talking about, C-H-A-N, sometimes C-H-A-N. Chan is a meditative process, meditative practice that is a non-dualist in essence. It goes down the Korean peninsula, it becomes Song. It crosses the Sea of Japan, it runs into the Shinto religion and the summarized Bushido code, and it takes on Zen. As it goes south, it comes in Tien. So Buddhism moves and transforms in these different ways as it moves. It starts out, one way, the way people know, but Buddhism takes the shape of wherever it is, because it's a philosophy underneath it. People say, why is Japanese Buddhism different from Tibetan and different from this? Well, if you know something about the culture where they are, you can see, oh, well, that's because these teachings filtered through in this way. Buddhism is about speaking to people in their own language, and that's more than just English or Tibetan or Pali or something like that. It's in a way that can be understood.
And here's my kind of summary statement. Perhaps we could say liberation within our views, not liberation from our views. So in other words, you still have opinions. We still have opinions and views, but we don't get so entrenched and attached to them that we completely ignore other people and we're not teachable. The freedom comes from within the conflict of mortality, not from conflict. So in other words, the conflict or the suffering doesn't really go away. It's the nature of human beings and interactions and so on. But the freedom isn't to try to fix everything and everybody in this world, but to find freedom from attachment to trying to fix everything and finding this sort of liberation within the midst of conflict.
Like there's a concept in Buddhism called Shenpa, where you keep getting hooked. It literally means like to be hooked. You keep getting hooked by the same dumb stuff over and over and over again. And so you're trying to get past that, and you do it, a lot of it is through meditation, coming to understand how you really think. So, for example, the Dhammapada, which is kind of a collection of the teachings of the Buddha, starts at the very beginning with a discussion about your thoughts. And it's kind of like, as a man thinketh, so is he, only it's a Buddhist version of it, that your actions will follow your thoughts, just like a cart follows an ox, so if you can control your thoughts, then your actions will be good. there's even like this leaky roof analogy, like if your roof is tight, you know, the rain doesn't get in. If your mind is tight and focused and reflective, then your passions don't like get in and govern your life. You know, your emotions don't take control. And I think we get that as members of the church. We're trying to overcome the natural man and suppress those desires. I think Buddhists are really good at that. And because of that, they're kind and compassionate and all the things that we, you know, would want Christians to act like. So behaviors line up really pretty good, I think. If you listen to Buddhist speakers and writers, like Thich Nhat Hanh is a kind of he's been on Oprah, right? And he talks about the idea that there is no independent self, like it doesn't exist. And part of your meditation needs to be that you need to realize that there is no independent you. And once you do that, once you like completely extinguish this idea of yourself, then you're going to transcend. You're going to be on your way, if you're not there, to achieving nirvana. We would have to say, no. It's important not to be selfish, but we don't want to extinguish our individual identity, right? We have an independent identity that's eternal, and it will be. So premortal individuality, mortal individuality, and postmortal individuality. And we're required to take our will and conform it to God's by making choices, but it's us choosing, you know, with our individual self to do it. So I think that's a point where it's a little different, and it comes from our understanding of the plan of salvation and our relationship to God, and you know, who we really are as sons and daughters of God.
And that too, interestingly, then kind of fits in very, very closely to certain LDS concepts of agency, right? Agency then not so much as I am in control, because that's part of what the Buddhism is denying. It's denying the fact that you have control over the consequences of your actions, right? You have control over your actions, potentially, but you don't have control over those consequences, right? And often LDS thought tends to talk about agency in terms of I'm in charge, I'm in control of my own destiny. And I actually think the inverse is true. We're not in charge of our destiny. What we're in charge of is how we react to the things that happen to us. And that very much is what Buddhism is also arguing. They're arguing here then that in karma, we find ourselves in situations that are a consequence of previous actions that you're not in control of at that moment. But you are in control of which trajectory karmically do you choose. Do you choose to react well and make good choices, or do you react poorly and make bad choices, right?
Mortality is never meant to be easy, right? So the idea that mortality is a test, and that even though you're trying the very best you can to keep the commandments and do what's right, that bad things are going to happen to you. I think that's common ground. Never ever being able to completely get rid of things that are part of the fallen world until we have the Savior come, you know, during the millennium. Then it gets better, and ultimately, you know, when you're exalted, it gets better. For a Buddhist, it never ever goes away until you stop, you know, reincarnating. I mean, the world will be difficult. Now, one thing a Buddhist would say is that you can control your reaction to suffering. Like you don't have to suffer because you've changed the way you feel about, you know, suffering.
Start with samatha, which is mindfulness of breathing or anything else. There's 40 kasinas, and kasinas are anything is an object of meditation. It is anything you can focus your mind on to the exclusion of other phenomena. Some people use colors, some people use the breath, some people use physical sensations in the body. You can do it when you're walking and the feet hitting the ground. But it's about putting your mind on something like a candle in a dark room, and that's where everything is. And if you've never tried to hold your mind on something, for a little while, you don't know how little control you really have over your mind. But that's kind of the beginning of it. And then you start using that sharpened tool to analyze yourself and realize what you're not. what you're not. Buddhism doesn't posit, well, Buddhist philosophy doesn't posit what you are. They'll just help you see the things you're not, and what you are, in truth, will manifest experientially.
I'll tell you the thing that's most interesting to me. So like I've been a member of the church most of my life, so I focus more on Christianity. And but one of the things I've noticed since I've been studying and teaching world religions is I'm really kind of curious how meditation like fits in, because we use the word sometimes. Prophets have used the word. It shows up in the scriptures and in our hymn book, I think, is in several places. And we talk about pondering, but I think one thing that I have learned or am learning from some of the Eastern religions and Buddhism is this idea that you don't have to rush through everything, you don't have to force everything. Sometimes it's good to just like slow down. Like you're familiar with the reference to Joseph Smith where the Lord just says, "Be still and know that I'm God." Like we're not really very good at that as members of the church, but I think it's valuable. And so in that sense, I think I'd like to be more that way, but it's hard to slow down when you're in a fast-paced Western society and you're a Mormon and you have all these things you got to do.
It is a technique and a skill. And what I find interesting, that I point, when I teach this, sometimes I'll tell students, just go to LDS.org and in the search bar, just type in meditation, and you will find hundreds and hundreds of quotes dating all the way back to Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, where we are told as Latter-day Saints that we need to meditate, right? And one of the interesting things is you find is almost never did they actually tell you what that looks like. What does it mean for a Mormon to meditate? What does it mean to have President Kimball come out in 1974 or whatever it was and tell us that we need to meditate and ponder on the scriptures? Well, we use this word, but we never actually talk about techniques. Buddhism has 2,000 years worth of techniques and skill development on what it means to meditate. And I think there's something of value there. I actually thought it was really interesting. I was sitting in sacrament meeting the other day, and my 8-year-old was flipping through The Friend, that little magazine for the youth, and she came up on this one thing that essentially was teaching the youth how to meditate, right? Our youth, had this cartoon of this little boy that felt all stressed because of everything that's happened, and the cartoon essentially said, find a quiet place, sit down, and just let your thoughts go, and breathe in and breathe out. Like that's mindfulness meditation, right? And they don't call it meditation, and they didn't say that it was taken out of the Buddhist tradition, but a lot of these techniques are the same across all wide variety, right? So when you talk about meditation within the Taoist tradition that develops very distinctly from the Buddhist tradition in India, they're still using a lot of the exact same sort of meditative techniques. And you see the same sort of techniques used by Christian monks in early Christianity. So there is some value that comes out of that.
Back to the idea of how's it changed my life.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Anything that moves me closer to liberation from my natural man default setting is joyful. And then most importantly, it has brought me back to the joy in Christ place. Because the liberation comes in and through and because of Him.